To kick us off today, we're joined by Robert M. Lee. Now, Robert is CEO of Dragos and got his start in security as a US Air Force Cyber Warfare Operations Officer, tasked to the National Security Agency, where he built a first-of-its-kind mission identifying and analyzing national threats to industrial infrastructure. He's going to be providing an overview of the threat landscape targeting the electric power sector. He'll also share his perspective on the Biden administration's 100-day action plan focused on increasing OT visibility, detection, and response in ICS networks. And he'll conclude with recommendations for owners and operators on how to improve threat detection and response. So, Robert, with great pleasure to welcome you here. Over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for allowing me to join you today as we talk about a topic that tends to be in a lot of folks' minds these days, OT security, but specifically in the electric power sector. Now, our electric sector for years has been one of the sort of forward-leaning sectors as we've looked at security in general. And for years, we've seen that we've had multiple electric systems in the United States and around the world that have been really resilient. And those systems were built with that safety and affordability and that reliability in mind. But our systems are changing in many, many ways. And there's many threats that are explicitly targeting those electric power systems and the operation systems and industrial control systems they depend upon. So my purpose today is really just to talk to you about what we're seeing over at Dragos, give you our insights from our technology and services customers, and hopefully empower you to make better choices as you go forward in this interesting, crazy world. So my presentation is really just going to follow into trends, threat groups, talk a little bit about ransomware, and of course, the supply chain topic that tends to be on people's minds. But I'll end it, as noted previously, on that 100-day electric plan, which we really saw the electric sector step up in a huge way at the request of government and do a voluntary 100-day plan in the United States. We're now seeing those other 100-day plans modeled after that one going into other sectors. And so hopefully that'll be useful for everybody to understand kind of what's been happening. So as we kick off, I mentioned that our systems are changing in a lot of different ways. And when you look at the electric sector, as noted before, a really, really resilient environment. But the demands of the energy portfolio that we have, this shifting from fossil fuels to more clean energy and renewable energy, now getting into a lot more renewables and sort of inverter-based resources and similar coming online, market operators actually having some impact with what gets dispatched, just a lot of variety and change, probably at a rate that I don't think anybody's ever seen before in the electric system, all coupled with increased connectivity, which is a good thing. Like especially early in my career, the idea of connecting up anything was terrifying. But as we've seen, the idea of connecting those systems up and getting some value out of Industry 4.0, digital transformation, whatever you want to call it, we're starting to see more safe and reliable and affordable systems as a result. But with that changing portfolio, those changing systems, the increasing complexity and automation, and the increasing connectivity comes a lot of differences than where we were even just 5, 6, 7 years ago. You add on top of that industrial specific threats, those adversaries that are explicitly targeting our industrial or OT environments, and that creates an environment where we need to just be on top of our game. And so, obviously there's been major attacks before in the electric sector that we all talked about, and I've had the privilege to respond to and analyze the Ukraine 2015 cyber attack. The first time electric power was taken down due to a cyber attack. 2016 happened again at the transmission level in Ukraine. But since then, we've seen a bunch of other groups, some of which I'll talk about today, target those systems as well. Sometimes in the news, we hear about them. Sometimes we don't. I usually like to tell people that threats are worse than you realize, but not as bad as you want to imagine. Way more is happening than gets made public. But no, the phishing email that you saw on the news isn't going to take down the grid because there's not one grid, and that's not how cyber attacks on our infrastructure really work. Maybe the phishing email gets somebody access, but there's a whole lot of other work that has to happen before you're able to impact the physics of our environments. So every year it seems that industry experts and vendors and whatever else get in front of people and go, oh my gosh, the threats are so much worse than they have been before. And we can become a little bit numb to that. And it's not a dishonest thing. It is true. We're consistently seeing more threats, but it's not too often that that's not going to hold true. Like we're constantly looking, and so we find more things, and as we find more things, we see more threats, and as we see those threats, we can talk about them, and that's good. But we want to not hype up the problem. So every year, Dragos puts out these year in review reports, which is our insights from our Dragos platform customers, the incident response cases we work, our intel analysts. It's just all the insights and the threats and vulnerabilities and incident response cases we see. And we noticed that we might be falling into that same trap of, oh, the threats are getting worse, but we didn't really know how to quantify that. So what we did is we sat down and we said, look, for every group that we track, so every adversary group, usually state actors, when those adversary groups are active, obviously we're going to talk about them. But at some point, they're not going to be active or we lose visibility into them. And so let's say after a year or so, when we're not seeing new cases with that group, we might want to move that out of the public eye so that people focus on what's relevant and active. And when we try to measure the threat landscape, we put together the concept that if for every one group we were tracking, one or more groups fell off, that'd be a great thing because that means it's going down over time. Probably not likely, but that'd be a good outcome. 1 to 2 would probably be a normal rate of growth. In other words, for every 2 groups we find, 1 falls off. We're only growing by 1 group at a time in that year period, not 1 group per year, but 1 group at a time. That makes sense. For every 2 that come on board, 1 leaves. It's not great, but it's manageable. What we've seen, though, every 3 that come online, 1 leaves, which means there's a 3x growth in the threat landscape over the last year. Now, that doesn't mean we all need to freak out. Those threats are not all created equally. But the fact that there's multiple groups explicitly focused on industrial and there's more appearing by a 3x rate than are disappearing is something that really deserves our attention and make sure that we're understanding kind of where that hurricane path is going in the community and making sure we stay ahead of that, because we don't get the opportunity to just make massive changes in industrial environments on a quarterly, annual, biannual basis. Some of these programs and projects and efforts can take years to build up, and we need to stay ahead of the adversaries. So that's kind of how we've looked at it. And I'm going to talk about those groups as well, but we also take a look at kind of what's going on in the vulnerability space. And I think that a lot of focus gets paid attention to vulnerabilities because it's naturally you walk into an environment, you go, oh my gosh, there's legacy systems and unpatched software. You gotta deal with these vulnerabilities. And it's a little bit like, hey, calm down. Like some of the vulnerabilities are useful, like an ability for an adversary to get access to a historian and pivot into the operations environment. That's useful. Some of these vulnerabilities are trash. It doesn't introduce any new functionality in the environment that already wasn't native there. So the adversary doesn't need to leverage that vulnerability for any reason. Why bother your operations and engineers to go patch a vulnerability that doesn't actually introduce any new risks? So we wanted to take a good look at the vulnerabilities as well. And then kind of our year in review, we pulled out some stats around what are we actually seeing. And at the Intel team at Dragos, they have vulnerability analysts as well that go through every single one of the vulnerabilities. And we try to put it into kind of a green, yellow, red category. Green is this doesn't introduce any new risk. Don't worry about it. Yellow is some new risk, but it's not all that bad. Maybe no operational impact, or it's just not an emergency. Like get to it in your next maintenance cycle. And then red is, yeah, these really matter. Adversaries could take advantage of these, and these do introduce new risk, and you really need to address these now. Only about 7% of the vulnerabilities fall into that kind of now category, which should relieve some of the temperature, if you will, of what happens in our community when we're always trying to play whack-a-mole with these vulnerabilities. But where I am very optimistic about our ability to start getting into these environments and detecting threats and getting visibility, the state of vulnerabilities needs to increase quite a bit in terms of how we address them, our maturity around the discussion, and also our interaction with the OEMs, those original equipment manufacturers. I think OEMs get beat up a lot about really trash and stupid vulnerabilities, like stunt hacking type stuff or some conference presentation. Sometimes it's just not worth the OEM focusing on it. But sometimes there's vulnerabilities that they don't address that are really, really impactful. And working with them to help them understand which ones really matter and which ones don't, where it's okay to drop the ball and where it's okay not to, it needs to be a bilateral discussion. So it's not let's beat up on the OEMs, it's let's all have a more mature conversation. So when we looked at the vulnerabilities, what we found is that consistently a significant portion of them have errors and issues. 20% across all industries, 27% in the electric industry contain errors in the CVEs. The advisories themselves, 46% of the time in the electric sector have incorrect data. So as you're trying to operate on this vulnerability you're reading, to have incorrect data in the advisory or the CV itself is problematic. You might be putting in a lot of work and not really addressing the issue. Sometimes it's simple stuff like the CVSS, that score is wrong and it changes your priority level. Sometimes it's wrong hardware, wrong software, wrong vulnerability. Sometimes the patch doesn't actually fix the vulnerability, just the proof of concept code that the researcher submitted. So we need a lot of love on those. Further, 56% in the electric sector had a patch, but no alternative mitigation. So over half the time, we're putting our security people and our operators in a really bad situation to just say patch or don't. And that's not appropriate. There's other mitigations you can take. There's firewall actions, there's network access, there's, if you're using application whitelisting on an HMI as an example, there's all sorts of things to mitigate those vulnerabilities other than patching. And then we find that 26% of the advisories have no patch at all. And of all of these, 21% have no patch and no alternative mitigation. So 21% of the time, we're just telling people you're screwed. And that's where we've got to step it up and be a little bit more mature around what we can do in security than just patch or don't. And again, not to just beat up on OEMs, but we looked at some cellular gateways and cellular routers and kind of the wireless bridges, serial to Ethernet gateways, those types of things in industrial environments recently, where our analysts are constantly looking at the vulnerabilities and finding new vulnerabilities and responsibly disclosing them to the vendors. And sometimes that interaction is great. Sometimes we find vulnerabilities, get an immediate response, sometimes within hours, and the OEM works really, really hard to get something turned out as fast as possible, sometimes in just a couple weeks or a month. Even if it does take a long time for folks to put it in the field, the OEM stepping up in that way. Sometimes you get ignored. Sometimes there's still the cease and desist letters that come through because people don't quite understand vulnerability research. And every now and then you get situations where the vulnerability doesn't get patched for a year or two. And that's obviously problematic. Recently, we were working with an OEM that we reported 8 0 days to them, right? Eight unknown and undisclosed vulnerabilities. And they looked at all 8 and they were all valid. And the OEM said, well, we're going to address 1 out of the 8. And again, we just have to have a better discussion and really set those expectations of what right looks like. I don't expect every OEM to be able to respond to everything, but at worst, we need to be able to be public to the community to go, okay, the OEM prioritized this 1 out of 8, but here's recommendations on these other 7 issues of either you shouldn't care about some of them at all, or here's other security controls that can be applied instead of just patching. Now, as we move into the threat groups, the electric sector bears a lot of the groups. So at Dragos, we track 15 different state adversaries that explicitly target industrial control environments. Sometimes they already have a capability to do disruptive attacks. The Electrum group was responsible for the Ukraine outages as an example. Sometimes they're just at the beginning stage of their journey and they're doing reconnaissance and they're trying to get into industrial networks, but they're not able to take anything down yet. And we'll talk about some of these as well. But out of the 15 that we track that are around every industry, 11 out of the 15 target electric. Now, we have to be careful of visibility bias here. The electric sector tends to be more mature than other sectors, which means they're further along in their visibility journey. Now, I'm not saying that we're a majority of the communities even monitoring their OT networks yet. That's not accurate. But significantly more in the electric sector are monitoring and getting the visibility inside the networks and inside those OT environments than other sectors. So it's not terribly surprising that with that visibility comes the discovery of new threats. And so it's not terribly surprising that electric is maybe the one that we see the most threats in. But 11 out of 15 would suggest that, as we all know, it's a critical infrastructure. It's probably one of the preeminent critical infrastructures, and a lot of state adversaries are deeply interested in that. So we want to help people understand not just, ooh, look, there's threats, but what are the recommendations? What are the tactics, techniques, procedures, or the behaviors of these adversaries that you should worry about? Let's not play whack-a-mole in every indicator, anomaly, or vulnerability. Let's focus on those repeatable patterns and behaviors that we can detect and get insights into, and what makes sense to get if you're trying to detect these threats. So, just to give you an example of some of these, this is one that was not to the far right of being able to get disruptive attacks in infrastructure, was kind of in the middle lane of they were getting access to industrial networks and they're stealing off data that would be useful to creating disruptive capabilities, but they're not there yet. And then that group's TalentIte. We've been tracking them since 2019. Proofpoint actually came out and identified some of the original phishing emails from the group, which was fantastic. And when we started digging into it, we found additional insights, additional targeting, additional infrastructure from these adversaries. And every time they were theming their phishing emails, their capabilities, their infrastructure around NERC, around licensing certification bodies and engineering groups, around legitimate engineering firms. It was a overt focus of trying to get to the engineering side of the house. It's not just, oh, it's an IT phishing email. It's phishing emails explicitly trying to get operators and engineers to open them, to which then it would drop normal kind of IT malware. Don't over freak out about malware in ICS. There are disruptive ICS specific capabilities we have to be aware of. But a lot of times that malware is just a tool, whether it's PowerShell or something custom, it's just a tool to get access. Then it's about what the adversary does with that access in that environment. And so TalentIte is an example as we think about kind of how they operate. They're consistently getting in, taking screenshots of HMIs, pulling off data they can, and trying to make those disruptive capabilities. Again, we haven't seen them make one or deploy one yet. We don't want them to have that capability though. On the kind of the far left of the spectrum, there's some groups like STIBNITE here, and our group names are always just industrial minerals. But STIBNITE here, this is super interesting because they're not able to get into the ICS yet, or the OT, because there is no ICS or OT yet of where they're targeting. So I'm going to play that back to hopefully make sense out of this. Why do I care about STIBNITE? Well, you see, STIBNITE's a group that we've been tracking since late 2019 and have seen consistent targeting even this year and the various sites they're going after. And they're explicitly going after renewable energy sites in Azerbaijan. Now, they've started to expand the scope to the state oil company, but there's a lot of natural and renewable energy resources they're going after. But what's interesting about that, why I said they couldn't get in the ICS yet, because the wind farms and the renewable energy projects in Azerbaijan are not finished yet. They're in construction. Azerbaijan wants to be able to move towards more renewable energy to have energy independence in the region. And when you think about classic conflicts between state actors, energy independence is usually one of those big topics. There's a lot of control that countries can exert by having energy reliance on other folks. Having energy independence removes some of that sort of pressures and levers in politics. And so that usually gets people a little bit upset. So Azerbaijan is making a good move to get energy independence, and some regional adversary doesn't really love that. And so all the targeting is on the contractors and the OEMs and the folks coming in to set up, and the integrators and similar around the projects, but they're not even operational yet. So we expect an ICS disruptive capability. But I talked about that hurricane path. Here's the beginning of that journey. They're not to the ICS yet. They're not to the disruptive capabilities. But now, ideally, a couple years before they get there, we're going to identify who they are, how they operate, where they're targeting, and get those folks the security insights they need well beyond, or well before, I should say, something ends up being disruptive. And when you look at any of these operations, like I mentioned with TalentIte, when you look at STIBNITE, it's classic type phishing email. It's poet rat malware is just a normal type of IT malware. Gain remote access, move into the networks. In this case, using native tools like Mimikatz, or I guess PowerShell-like tools like Mimikatz to do lateral movement around the environment. And that might happen at that layer 5, level 4 kind of Purdue model IT networks. Sometimes your IT networks, sometimes your OEM's IT networks. But at some point then, they get access to VPNs, integrations, interconnections, team viewer sometimes, which is unfortunate, remote access into these operations environments. And those remote accesses, again, can come in a lot of different forms and fashion. When they finally get there, that's when we start to see those unique industrial behaviors, how they're moving across the operations environment, what they're taking, what they're stealing, how they're stealing it. The project file manipulations, not for these scope folks, but for other types of groups. And so that's where the IT piece moves to the side. I'm not worried now about an IT malware or phishing email. I'm worried about, can I see the movements? Can I see the behaviors? Can I see the manipulation or the exfiltration in the industrial environment and what's happening really in the east and the west of those networks? Not just what's leaving your site, but what's actually taking place down in those environments. And of course, that gets us into a discussion about ransomware, because when it comes to ransomware, and we've all seen a lot of the discussions about this, there are so many more ransomware cases happening behind the scenes than what's getting publicly reported. We routinely take significantly more incident response cases for ransomware in OT networks than ever gets reported. And sometimes that's completely appropriate. So in one case study, an example, we responded to a power company that got ransomed on their operations side. And when we ended up doing the incident response, very interestingly, the adversary had been in that network, in those OT networks, for over a month, moving around, finding locations to then target and encrypt, and then did the attack. The attack itself took less than an hour to conduct. And so it looks like, oh my gosh, ransomware is so quick. How do we ever defend against this? But in reality, you had over a month to detect those adversary behaviors in the operations environments. But if you're only monitoring host-based logs into a SIEM, or you're only monitoring your IT networks, you're not going to see what's going on in your operations networks. That really is that network visibility, that systems of systems view, that east and west traffic analysis. That's the kind of stuff where you'll be able to see what's happening and be able to get ahead of these things long before they become problematic. Human operated ransomware is problematic because adversaries break in and figure out exactly what to lock up. That takes them time. You, as a defender, should take advantage of that time to do detection and response, because prevention will fail at some point. All right, and so when we think about it from a supply chain perspective, there's a lot of our OEMs that have, and integrators and service providers that have direct connections into our operations networks. When people talk about supply chain, sometimes I hear people focused on rice grain sized chips and hardware, and that is not where we should be focused. Okay, I'm not saying that doesn't matter. I'm not saying that can't happen. Although many of the cases that's been reported have been hyped up, that's fine. There should be hardware supply chain validation, and governments around the world should think a lot about that. In many ways, though, that is outside the ability of an individual utility to be able to deal with. But what we can deal with is software supply chains. What we can deal with is the supply chains of our vendors getting access to our environments. And what does that mean? And how do we assure that? It's not going to just be that stupid paper drill that we all go through, but it's going to be the validation of what's actually happening with those connections and what's taking place. A great example of this was in SolarWinds. So in SolarWinds, a lot of the reporting was around IT networks, and Microsoft and FireEye did a great job talking about compromises in those IT and government networks. What most people don't realize, though, is there were significant compromised versions of SolarWinds all around the operations community, especially in the electric community. And we ended up getting pulled into a lot of incident response cases where people didn't think they had SolarWinds at all. And then they'd find out that they did have SolarWinds. Then they'd find out it was a compromised version of SolarWinds. They'd call for instant response. It should be an easy check in that case of DNS logs to determine if there was actually activity. But most people didn't actually have good visibility and asset identification of where the equipment was, where that software was, nor did they have the right logging in place. So you couldn't be assured that you weren't compromised. I guess technically you are compromised because of the compromised software, but you couldn't assess whether or not the adversary got second stage access to your environment or not. And now you're getting into deep hunting and really, really rigorous work, which it could have just been a simple checking of the logs. So for 9+ months, a strategic adversary had direct access to many of our operations networks around the world. You may think, well, I've got a segmented environment. First and foremost, there are no air gaps. Get over it. Maybe in nuclear power. Outside of that, cut it out. But for the rest of us, you might have some level of segmentation. But the reality is our OEMs and integrators and others do have access, and it bypasses all your monitoring and filtering and things from the IT level 9 times out of 10. What we found was that at least 2 global OEMs were compromised in the compromised versions of SolarWinds, and were using that software across maintenance links and across their VPN connections for diagnostics and maintenance purposes directly down to DCS, SCADA kind of operations environments. So we knew that the adversary, whether or not they intended to or not, had access, remote direct access to things like turbine control software across the United States. That's the kind of stuff that we need to be able to detect and understand who's got access, how has it changed over time, what's actually happening in those networks. Can we see what's going on in the network level at the ICS? It's incredibly critical to get that. We've also seen suppliers be compromised directly and honestly just handle the incident response very poorly. Some OEMs are great on this, but some, again, need to step it up. We identified a breach into a electric OEM provider out of South Asia. And when this South Asian based OT and ICS hardware and software provider in the electric sector was compromised. We reached out and let them know. We could see exfiltration coming out of their networks to include things like their intellectual property and things that customers wouldn't want them to have, of course. We notified them and they said, thanks, we'll look at it. I said, you going to do anything about it? Yeah, we think we're okay. We wrote an intel report and our customers got it. And many of our electric customers, a couple of our electric customers, I should say, had them directly accessing into their operations networks. And so those customers finally decided to sever those links until the vendor could assure that they're taking it seriously and that they're cleaning up the environment. The vendor decided, okay, well, I'll run some anti-malware scans and we'll bring in a local team, and they did instant response. We looked at it again and said, you're still compromised. They said, no, we're fine. We're good. And yet again, we can see that there's adversaries taking data off their environments, being compromised, and consistently still having that remote access into electric companies around the world. So we as a community not only need to get better at the OT security piece and in getting the visibility in there to see and assess and assure, but we also need to get better, again, kind of those mature discussions of what are those expectations between suppliers and customers and their customers around compromises and how we deal with incidents and how we are transparent out to people so that we have informed understandings of what's going on. Now, ending it on some high notes, the 100-day action plan was announced in April of this past year. What it was is the White House went to the electric sector and said, look, there's been a lot of focus on segmentation, patching, vulnerability management, access control, passwords, all that kind of stuff over the years. We get it. Like 80% of the standards and frameworks out there push for that. But that's all prevention based. What we don't have is that visibility, detection, and response capability at the OT layer. And cases like SolarWinds highlight that can be very problematic. Can you all work with us to figure out how to solve this? Which is awesome. The government coming in to say, here's why I'm concerned and here's what I'm concerned about it, but leaving it to the sector to figure out how they deal with it allows the expertise around the room to really come to bear. That's fantastic. So the White House partnered with DHS and DOE to go talk to the electric sector at a CEO level and said, y'all should do something. We don't care what you do. Pick anything you want. But you need to go get visibility and kind of monitoring detection software for OT, purpose-built for ICS, not just an add-on to an IT product, but purpose-built. Put it in there and be able to share insights with the government. You can do it anonymously. You don't have to share your data, but we're curious about what you find in terms of threats and issues. And the electric sector, within a 100-day period, during this 100-day action plan, had 150 electric utilities sign up and say, let's go, we'll do it. We were not the only one involved, but we were kind of the main one involved, where a significant majority of those 150 ended up deploying our Dragos platform technology and opting into Neighbor Keeper, which is this collective defense kind of approach to be able to see in real time threats and vulnerabilities around the community without sharing any of your data or without sharing your identity. And so that left the how to the sector to go figure out, how can we do this together while getting the information that government needs to them without violating your identity and your privacy and your data. And NERC and others stepped up to be super supportive. EISAC jumped on and said, we'll join on as well. NERC even deployed practice guides on how to deploy these types of technologies in your environment without violating NERC CIP BES considerations. It was just wonderful to see the whole of the community step up. And while we were glad to be involved in it from a Dragos perspective, the real heroes of the discussion were all the electric utilities. And in many ways, I think they need to get promoted out a lot more in terms of how much the community was willing to do and answer the call when they understood the problem that existed and why the government cared about it. And that, to me, is public-private partnership. It's not, let me come in and tell you what you're going to do with prescriptive regulations. It's, I've got a problem. If y'all can solve it, we're good. And y'all go figure out how. And so what we're seeing now is that 100-day action plan in the electric sector. The President of the United States came out, signed a national security memorandum focused on industrial control systems, pointed that 100-day action plan to say that's what the gold standard is. All the other electric utilities that haven't done anything yet, move, let's go. We know what right looks like. And then for the other sectors, gas, chemical, water, we're going to start doing 100-day action plans with y'all as well. Give you the opportunity to address these things that we're concerned about. It's voluntary, but what an awesome opportunity to go do cool stuff together. And again, I think that's really awesome to see from this administration and from our infrastructure owners and operators. Lots of work to be done, but it's really, really useful to understand, why do I care? What am I supposed to accomplish? Believe the how that we're going to accomplish it to the industry and the experts in those fields. So just in summary, as we look across all the different things that you can do and should do, there's a lot of IT security things that you could do that you really shouldn't worry about in OT. They're just not worth the investment right now. But there's a couple that are really, really important, and you got to get it right. The first one is that as access restrictions and account management. If you can deploy multi-factor authentication for remote access, you should. You can't do it everywhere, but where you can, you should. At the same time, where you can, you should separate out Active Directory and domain controllers between your IT and the OT. We consistently see ransomware actors pop those things and write it down like a highway of death in operations. You should have response plans that get rehearsed with tabletop exercises at an executive level of the common kind of scenarios we're concerned with, like ransomware, Ukraine-style attacks, various instances of the various groups that we track. Those types of things should be rehearsed and ICS specific. Don't think your IT incident response plan or your IT incident response provider is going to cover ICS. That's the wrong way to view it. Segmentation where possible to limit lateral movement and adversary activity. It's not going to be foolproof, but where it's possible, feel free. Third-party monitoring, not just on assessment of the vendors, but the access itself. But that really goes into the visibility of getting insights in the environment and be able to monitor it, understand that east-west traffic analysis, the systems of systems interactions, and that can be useful for security as well as operations value. So getting that visibility and threat detection in place really is one of those core things to be done. And ultimately, if you get these things done and get that partnership between IT and OT going, we're going to be in a great place as a community. We're going to be able to get this done. And as I like to tell everyone, just remember that defense is doable. No matter how crazy it all seems, no matter how wild it all seems, no matter how good the adversary, us as defenders and a community can get this done. It isn't just given to us, but it is doable. So with that, I want to turn it back over in the studio. Thanks so much for allowing me to be with you today.